Last time, Deon thought he had finally found peace in the Demon King's castle. A hidden garden, fresh air, a rare moment of calm. But what looked like paradise turned into a nightmare when the plants tried to devour him. From there, things only spiraled: deeper betrayal, assassins, and even the shocking appearance of a human hero inside the demon's dungeon. Deon's every step looked like luck, but was it fate pulling him deeper into chaos? And just when it seemed he might escape, he nearly drank poison meant to kill him instantly. So, was it survival or destiny? If you want to watch the full recent parts of this insane story, all the links are waiting in the description. Ed immediately turned, confused, staring at his hand. He was nervous, wondering why the glass had flown away. In truth, Deon had only tried to swat away a persistent fly that annoyed him just as he was about to drink. His irritation led him to wave his hand too forcefully, and the glass slipped from his grip. Startled, he looked at the fragments on the floor, muttering that it hadn't been intentional. But his subordinate kept staring at the shattered glass and the spreading puddle. Deon noticed the unease in his gaze and looked again, this time spotting the poisonous fumes rising from the liquid. Ed bit his lip in anger and said it was poison. Deon realized his drink had indeed been poisoned. His deputy quickly scanned the surroundings, but no one was there anymore. Still, he was certain an outsider had infiltrated their ranks. Meanwhile, the assassin fled back to camp, leaping swiftly through the trees. Panic gripped him. He had to report this to the Empire, or better yet, to Cruel himself. The commander of Squad Zero was far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Soon, Jakar learned what had happened. He gathered the demons, declaring that someone had dared to enter their territory with the intent to kill the commander of Squad Zero. The demons trembled nervously, questioning how such a thing was possible. No one besides Deon had even noticed the intruder. Jakar silenced them, saying punishment for allowing an outsider would come later. For now, their priority was to ensure no other enemies remained within the camp. The demons obeyed and scattered. Deon, standing behind Jakar, watched with displeasure. Sweat beaded on his brow. He realized just how close he had come to death. Ed approached, bowing his head in guilt, apologizing for failing to detect the intruder. Deon replied that he never imagined anyone could get past him. This only proved how skilled the assassin was. Frustrated, Deon thought about resigning as commander of Squad Zero. Because of this, even the Empire's fools had nearly succeeded in killing him. All because of this assassin, he couldn't even enjoy a simple drink. He glanced at a nearby demon holding a bottle of alcohol, then called out to Ed. With his head still lowered, Ed said he would humbly accept any punishment Deon chose. But Deon wasn't concerned with that. Instead, he asked if the bottle had been sealed before being poured. Ed looked up, confused, then confirmed it. Deon grabbed the demon by the shoulders, snatched the bottle, and asked again was he certain the glass had been poisoned, not the bottle? The demon froze in fear and confusion. Deon smiled and asked if that meant it was safe to drink straight from the bottle. Relieved, he happily thought that the drink was untouched. Meanwhile, Cruel had already received word. An assassin arrived, breathless, declaring that Deon was indeed dangerous. The rumors had not been exaggerated. If things continued like this, the Empire wouldn't stand a chance. Thinking about his next move, Cruel tapped his finger on the table and said that this assassin was no small fry, yet had returned completely confused. Now that they had confirmed the existence of the Zero Squad commander and that he was as strong as rumored, they needed that fool to defeat the demons. Since they had the Zero Squad commander on their side, one man asked if Cruel meant another hero of the Empire. Cruel confirmed it and added that, since the commander was not here now, they would have to retreat. The commander protested, saying that if they retreated, it would appear as though they were fleeing in fear of the Zero Squad commander. Once others started looking down on them, it would weaken their standing. But Cruel slammed the table, cutting him off, and declared that they would retreat, but if anyone dared to pursue them, those people must be killed. He reminded them there was no need to fight for useless, distant lands where not a single ray of light reached. This was exactly what they had to make the demons understand. He believed they must retreat without showing any weakness, proving they had no intention of fighting unless the demons invaded the human world. The commander agreed and said he would deliver this message to the troops, but then asked what they would tell the emperor. Cruel replied that his orders were to reclaim the empire's lands that had been seized by the demonic realm, not to expand further into their territory. The empire's lands had already been restored, and there was no need to provoke more friction between their kingdoms. That would be their explanation. He thought to himself that this was the right decision. There was no need to go overboard and ruin his debut as a hero. He had come this far and wouldn't allow anyone to tarnish his reputation. With a sigh, he added that they could only hope the Zero Squad commander would not cause chaos. The commander noted that he had heard the man rarely intervened in battles and asked if that meant they would be safe. Cruel answered that, if true, their task would be much easier. In that case, it was time to begin their plan. Suddenly, an excited soldier rushed into the tent, calling for the commander. He reported that demon troops were advancing toward them, led by none other than the Zero Squad commander. Hearing this, Cruel's eyes widened as he straightened up, while the commander grew visibly nervous. Cruel's face darkened, and he clenched his teeth, silently cursing that their entire plan had been ruined. Meanwhile, Deon advanced relentlessly, slaughtering everyone in his path. After stabbing an Imperial soldier to death, he laughed maniacally with a crazed look, then spun his dagger, spraying blood across the battlefield. In an instant, he closed in on another soldier, slicing off the hand that held his sword. The man fell back, screaming in agony as blood gushed from the wound. Deon slowly approached him, delivering the final fatal blow and letting the body collapse to the ground. Sitting beside the corpse, Deon laughed hysterically and began stabbing it repeatedly. Ed, who stood nearby with another soldier gripped by the throat, watched Deon and thought he must have downed an entire bottle of alcohol, for he seemed completely drunk. Yet, despite the madness, no better situation could be imagined thanks to Urtzer. Morale among their forces was soaring. One Imperial soldier stumbled back in terror, eventually pressing his back against a tree. Trembling, he stared at the Zero Squad commander and muttered that he was no man at all, he was a devil. Who else could deserve that title if not him? Deon's eyes rolled back in twisted pleasure after the murder, but the moment he heard the soldier's trembling voice, his gaze immediately lowered to him. The terrified soldier began to cry. Without breaking eye contact, his hands searched desperately for his sword. He thought he must fight to survive, yet his fear consumed him. His heart sank further when he realized the commander of the Zero Squad was advancing toward him. He snatched up the sword and pointed it at Deon, shouting for him not to come closer. His eyes darted to the shredded corpse lying behind him, and dread overwhelmed him. Would he end up the same? While he was drowning in those thoughts, Deon calmly approached, gently placed his hand on the blade, pushed it aside, and with a smile asked why he was sitting there. If he truly wanted to live, he had to try. The soldier trembled in horror, silently begging anyone for help. Deon raised his dagger and coldly said that without trying, he would die just like that. The soldier's thoughts cried out again for salvation. Just as Deon prepared to drive the dagger into him, a hero came to his rescue. Something was hurled with immense force, leaving a golden glow in the air. The soldier turned to see the commander of the Zero Squad struggling to block the attack. The impact overwhelmed him, throwing him backward until he crashed against a tree. The blow left Deon trembling and coughing violently. His deputy, Ed, rushed to his side in panic, calling out to him and asking if he was all right. Deon gave no answer, only covering his mouth as blood poured out. Enraged, Ed spun around and shouted, demanding how anyone dared harm Sir Eret. But when his eyes fell on the armored figure who had struck the blow, his voice faltered. This was no ordinary opponent, it was a hero. Cruel flexed his wrist in irritation and declared that he would kill him with a single strike. Ed looked stunned, torn between fury and fear, while his commander coughed again. Deon pulled something from beneath his clothes and opened his hand. Resting in his palm was a shattered pendant. Ed froze. His fear deepened when he realized it was Miss Real's protective pendant. Without it, Sir Eret would have been killed instantly by that attack. All eyes turned toward the hero. The soldier who had narrowly escaped death moments before broke into sobs, tears streaming down his face. To him, this was the Empire's new hope, the battlefield star, Cruel. Smiling through his tears, he reached out a trembling hand, believing he was finally saved. But before he could finish speaking, Deon suddenly appeared at his side and, with a single merciless swing, severed his head. The soldier never even realized what had happened. His body collapsed as his head rolled lifelessly to the ground. Deon then turned toward the hero. Standing opposite him, he studied him closely before smiling. "So, you're the new hero," he said. Cruel replied calmly that people called him that, though he did not believe he deserved the title. Deon raised his dagger, remarking that he had heard much about him, but there was something strangely familiar about his voice. Had they met before? Could he remove his helmet? Cruel asked if he was seriously suggesting that he remove his helmet in front of an enemy. Still, he admitted the voice also felt oddly familiar. Deon flipped his dagger into the air, catching it with ease, and said that if Cruel wouldn't take it off himself, he would be forced to do it for him. With sudden speed, Deon lunged forward, thrusting the dagger toward Cruel's head. At the very last moment, Cruel ducked sharply, dodging the strike. Looking up, he thought to himself how fast Deon was. For a brief instant, he lost sight of him. Cruel drew his sword in one smooth motion, meeting Deon's next attack with a powerful swing. Steel clashed as he parried, declaring that just because Deon was fast, it didn't mean his movements couldn't be tracked. Deon quickly stepped back, and his opponent mirrored the movement. They stopped opposite each other before Deon rushed forward again with a smile, asking if he had dodged right. Cruel, impressed, thought he must be skilled. As they closed in, both swung their weapons, clashing and parrying each other's blows. Pressing down on the hero's sword, Deon asked if it was true that he didn't feel worthy of the title of hero. Should he confirm this? The hero replied that he had no reason to. With his final word, his blade knocked Deon's dagger away with a loud clang. The two immediately exchanged a flurry of strikes. Cruel thought to himself that while Deon's speed was troublesome, his attacks lacked power. Realizing this, he quickly disarmed him. Striking Deon's arm, the dagger flew from his grip, spinning through the air before piercing the ground. Deon's hand trembled as he turned and looked at it with displeasure. Cruel seized the moment, pressing forward with the thought that he could win if he kept relying on his strength and endurance. Deon immediately snapped his attention back to him, grabbed the dagger at his hip, and blocked the incoming blow. Their blades collided, sending sparks flying as Deon's hands shook from the force. Cruel pressed down on the hero's sword, but Deon retaliated with a kick to his stomach, forcing him to slide back across the ground. The distance between them widened. Pointing his sword forward again, Cruel wondered why Deon's attacks were so weak. Was he holding back, hiding his true nature, or simply not in the mood to fight? Regardless, it gave him the advantage. Deon grinned and asked if he had already noticed. He raised both hands and said with a smile that this wasn't bad, but that was enough for today. Cruel snapped back in outrage. How dare he? The war wasn't over yet. They had only just crossed blades. Deon spread his arms wide and replied that it was already finished. He reminded Cruel that he had killed the commander of the 9th Squad. Even with the Empire reclaiming its lands, Deon seemed satisfied. He added that the demons had even invaded the human world, and they had merely defended themselves. Cruel shouted if he was joking, but Deon calmly said there was no point wasting more energy. Why not agree that both sides had defended their territories? Cruel fell silent, realizing Deon was right. There was no reason to abandon their plan and fight further when the Empire's lands had already been reclaimed. Still, if he continued the battle, he could potentially eliminate the commander of Squad Zero. Deon taunted him, asking if the new hero intended to start another war. Surely, the troops wouldn't agree to such a reckless move. Cruel turned to look at his soldiers. Many were wounded, and their morale had long since crumbled. He realized he had already lost control. Lowering his sword, he told Deon he would retreat this time. The demons were in high spirits, but their side had suffered heavy losses. It was wiser to return to the original plan. Deon faced the demon army, waved his hand, and with a smile told Cruel this was a good outcome. As he left, he added that he hoped they would never see each other again. He couldn't stand his voice. Cruel turned to the Imperial troops and ordered them to withdraw as well. The two armies separated, passing each other in tense silence. As Deon walked past the demon soldiers, he heard their joyful shouts celebrating that they had finally forced the enemy to retreat. They praised Eret for their victory, giving him all the credit. Unlike them, Ju was not pleased. With his arms crossed, he thought it was a waste to retreat at such a time. The Imperial forces were demoralized. This could have been their chance to advance. Still, he knew there must have been a reason for Deon's decision. When the commander of Squad Zero approached, he placed a hand on Deon's shoulder and told him he had done well. But Deon, overwhelmed by exhaustion, could no longer control his body. He cursed his weakness, lost balance, and collapsed into Jar's arms. Jar held him, worried, and asked what was wrong. Deon quietly replied that it was all because of his frail body. His whole frame burned with feverish heat. Jar thought in disbelief, how could Deon have shown such combat prowess in this state? Why did he stop the battle midway? It seemed Deon was already thinking ahead, suppressing his desire to fight further so that the enemy would never notice his condition. Ben and Ed rushed to the commander of Squad Zero, helping him to his feet and asking if he was all right. Jur thought that his defeat would directly impact the confidence of the demon army. He was truly incredible. Ed remarked that he was exhausted from fighting in such a weakened state, and Ben told him to immediately carry him inside. They informed Jar that they had to leave, and Jar asked them to take care of him. He reflected on how the commander of Squad Zero had appeared out of nowhere to protect their position. He had killed the former commander of the 7th Squad, prevented the hero from self-destruction, and accomplished other feats that even earned recognition from the Demon King himself. Although Jar understood he could not formally acknowledge him, he still felt out of place. Nevertheless, today he had shown them why he was the commander of the Demon Realm's Squad Zero. Smiling, he told Jar to leave the rest to him. Meanwhile, in the Demon King's palace, Rinnel suddenly rose from her seat, sensing something. A demon asked what was wrong, and she replied that it was broken. Grabbing him by the collar, she repeated more urgently that it was broken. He asked in alarm what exactly had broken the barrier. If so, this was a disaster. What if demonic monsters infiltrated the palace? Rinnel struck him on the head, exclaiming that it wasn't the barrier. How could mere demonic monsters break her protection? It was the pendant that Eric had given to Sir. Growing worried, she said she was certain he was now in grave danger. She needed to go to him. The demon was shocked and asked where she was going, reminding her that His Majesty had ordered her to guard the barrier. But Rinnel ignored him, radiating determination. She told Sir Eret not to worry, she was already on her way. Soon after, Deon returned to the palace and was greeted by the king, who congratulated him on his return. Waving it off, Deon replied modestly. Ed bowed in respect. The king approached, patting Deon on the shoulder, and said that he had already heard everything from Jar. Once again, Deon had pulled off something remarkable. He never failed to surprise. The king then asked how his meeting with the new hero went. Deon raised his head and replied that he had something important to report about him. Seeing his serious expression, the king assumed Deon had calmed down after the battle and suggested they discuss it inside. He added that the commander of the 2nd detachment had also brought news about the new hero. Hearing her name, Deon's face darkened as he recalled how she constantly forced him into different outfits. Amused, the Demon King laughed, noting Deon's reaction. He reassured him that she was too busy analyzing intelligence to leave her office for now, so he shouldn't worry. The king told Deon to change clothes and then report to him. Deon obeyed silently, his face expressionless. He changed as instructed and went to the king's office. His Majesty threw a stack of papers onto the table and told him to read them. There was something interesting inside. As Deon skimmed through the text, he suddenly grew furious at what he found. A voice suddenly called out his name, pulling him back to his senses. His eyes widened in confusion. Where was he? Was he inside the Demon King's castle? When had he returned? He was certain he had only just been on the battlefield. Rinal, teary-eyed, rushed to him and hugged him tightly, saying she was so glad he was safe. He was bewildered, wondering what she meant. All he remembered was drinking heavily, intending to get drunk before dying. He had downed an entire bottle and wondered if he had simply passed out. But he only drank one had his tolerance weakened. His liver was the only organ still functioning properly. Rinal hugged him even tighter and explained that the pendant she had given him had shattered. She immediately rushed to the battlefield, only to learn that he had already returned here. Relieved, she was overjoyed to have run into him so quickly. Deon froze in horror. The pendant was meant to prevent his death once. If it had broken, did that mean he was already on the brink of death? Rinal smiled happily and said he had managed to repel the new hero and defend the Demon Kingdom's territory. Ashamed, Deon thought that he must have gotten drunk again and caused a scene. Perhaps it really was time to quit drinking. Finally, he noticed the crumpled parchment in his hand. Curious, he unfolded it and saw a portrait of the hero, Cruel Heart. When he saw this name, his expression changed dramatically. A grin spread across his face as he thought to himself that he could never forget this name, not even in a million years. It belonged to the person he couldn't help but love, his older brother. He remembered the day Cruel caught him committing murder. Cruel opened the door to the room, his face darkening at the sight before him the corpses of a woman and a man he knew well lying on the floor, with Deon sitting beside them. Calling out to him, Cruel's voice trembled as he watched Deon's hand, still clutching a dagger, shake violently. Tears streamed down Deon's face as he looked up at his brother in shock, extending his bloody hand and begging for help. But Cruel drew his sword, biting his lip before swinging it down. Deon desperately asked for his brother's help again, but as the sword closed in, he cried out in confusion. And then blood was shed. Remembering this, Deon frowned and squeezed the parchment tightly, muttering that it meant he was a hero, but since when? He gently patted Rinal on the head, causing her to look up in surprise. Walking past her, he apologized, saying he had something to take care of and needed to leave. She touched the spot where his hand had rested and softly told him to be careful. Moments later, a demon approached her, remarking that the commander of the Zero Squad was truly frightening. Why had he suddenly gotten angry? Was she all right? Rinal's expression darkened, but then instantly brightened with delight as she blurted out that the wicked Sir Eret was so attractive. The demon stared at her, dumbfounded, before smiling awkwardly and deciding he should probably quit this job soon. Meanwhile, Deon reached his room and sat on the bed, glaring down at the parchment once again. Cursing the Emperor, he questioned whether the man had known everything that happened yet still labeled him a hero. Gritting his teeth, Deon growled in frustration, wondering why this had to happen right as he needed to return. He recalled being in the king's office, asking if the time had come to head to the Empire. The king confirmed it, and Deon replied that with his permission, he would also investigate the identity of the new hero. The king agreed, warning that Deon's prolonged absence from the Empire might raise suspicion. Then, placing a hand on his collarbone, Deon triggered a flash of bright purple light. A seal appeared on his body. It was both tracking magic and a form of insurance. The Demon King waved his hand and instructed him to report anything useful he discovered. Deon straightened his shirt as the king reminded him, He was both commander of the Zero Squad of the Demonic Kingdom and the hero of the Empire. Touching the seal, Deon questioned why he had to serve as a spy for the Demon King. The mark on his body was proof it wasn't just a dream. He suspected that whenever he experienced overwhelming stress, his memories would vanish. Each time he broke under pressure, he lost pieces of himself. Though he tried not to dwell on it, he still wondered how long he could keep this up. Suddenly, a knock came at the door. It was his deputy's voice announcing his arrival. Deon permitted him to enter. Ed stepped inside and explained that he had heard from His Majesty that Deon was leaving for the human world today. Rising from the bed, Deon thought to himself that the king must have already informed Ed. He confirmed it aloud, adding that there was something personal he also needed to uncover. Then he asked Ed directly if he wanted to tell him something. Ed hesitated, his expression uncertain. He wanted to share what the king had offered him. He remembered that recent conversation clearly. The moment he stepped into the king's office, His Majesty had asked him how he felt about becoming a squad leader. Shocked, Ed questioned if it was because the position of the 9th commander was now vacant. He confirmed his words, explaining that until now, all positions had been filled. That was why he had been appointed as deputy commander of the Zero Detachment. However, given his abilities, he was more than worthy of the position of commander. He offered this role to him first, asking what he thought about it. Ed looked down, reflecting on the offer. While serving under Sir Eret, he had nearly forgotten that this was the position he had always desired. He asked what would become of his duties as deputy commander of Squad Zero if he accepted. The king replied that someone else would have to be appointed, someone ranking just below him in skill. He told him to trust his decision. He wasn't trying to pressure him and would give him time to think. But if Ed refused, the role would be given to someone else. Would he really be content if someone weaker became his superior? Ed objected, but suddenly Deon pulled him from his thoughts. He asked if the Demon King had told him something, perhaps scolded him for drinking. Ed thought about sharing it, but chose not to, shaking his head and saying nothing had happened. Smiling, he added that since Deon was leaving, he would inform Weird, the cook, to prepare food for his journey to the human world. Deon thanked him, sensing Ed wanted to say more, but chose not to press him. A demon entered the room, announcing that the carriage was ready. Deon said he was leaving. At the door, he turned back, telling Ed to take care of himself until he returned. Ed bowed and wished him a safe journey. Deon paused, wondering if Ed had truly asked to be demoted from deputy commander because serving was too difficult. Troubled by the thought, he stopped and asked if there was anything Ed wanted him to bring back from the Empire. Ed looked puzzled. Deon hesitantly explained that since he was heading there, perhaps he would want something only available in the Empire. Stroking his chin, he added that Ed seemed to enjoy their snacks. Maybe he should bring something with a long shelf life or anything he requested. Ed laughed, thinking how rare it was for a commander to care so much for his subordinate. With a wide smile, he said he needed nothing. Deon asked again if he was sure, then said he would bring something to match his taste anyway. He changed clothes, put on his cloak, and prepared to leave. Before he departed, Ed reminded him to always wear the pendant Ben had given him, along with a cloak while in the human world. Deon assured him he understood. Ed shouted his goodbye, saying he would be waiting. His commander silently waved and left. Ed thought there was no other commander who relied so heavily on his men, but that didn't trouble him. To him, it showed how much Deon respected Sir Eret. When speaking with the king earlier, Ed had said he didn't want to become a detachment commander. He preferred being Sir Eret's second in command, wanting nothing more than to support him. Remembering this, Ed bowed once more and wished his commander a safe journey, determined to remain by his side as his deputy, no matter where he went. Meanwhile, Deon crossed the Empire's border and soon arrived at the estate where 2 guards stood watch at the gate. One yawned, complaining that no one had shown up today. His partner noticed movement on the road someone was approaching. Deon emerged from the forest and walked toward them. As he drew near, the guards ordered him to stop. They declared this was the estate of Count Hart, who was currently away, and no outsiders were permitted entry. Deon ordered the gates to be opened. One of the guards wondered what kind of behavior this was Deon not afraid of making Count Hart his enemy? The guard warned that if Deon came any closer, they would use weapons. At that moment, Deon removed his hood and pulled back his face mask, revealing his face. He declared that he was trying to enter his own house did they dare to stop him. The guards, shocked and unprepared for his return, called out his name in surprise. Word of his arrival spread quickly, and the servants abandoned their work to greet him. The front door opened, and Deon stepped inside, handing his suitcase to a servant. The others lined up in front of him, bowing their heads in greeting. He grimaced, remembering that she had told him there was no need for such formalities. After removing his outer coat, he was approached by the butler, Remember, who bowed respectfully and said it was good to see him return. Deon thought to himself that Remember had been here ever since he inherited the estate. His presence truly made the place feel like home. Deon smiled and said it had been a long time. Remember agreed it had already been 6 months. Then he asked if Deon had successfully completed the destruction of the garbage. At first, Deon didn't understand, but then realized Remember was referring to the public story, that Deon had been sent on an imperial expedition to slay monsters. Deon confirmed the tale, saying he had completed the task and returned. But he fell silent when Remember reached toward the plaster on his cheek, noticing his injury. Deon looked up in surprise as Remember admitted he was too old to deal with monsters himself. Deon brushed his hand away, embarrassed, and looked aside. He said he was fine, he was no longer a child. Remember agreed, reminding him that he was now an honorary count. He suggested Deon rest after his long journey, but Deon refused, saying he would go to meet the Emperor immediately. As Deon headed upstairs, Remember followed and asked if he truly intended to go at once. Deon confirmed and told him to prepare everything for the journey. Though he longed to rest, he was certain the Emperor already knew of his return. On the second floor, Deon stopped before a massive portrait, torn and stained with blood. Through the damage, he could still see the image of his family, especially the part where he and his older brother stood together. He told Remember there were also questions he needed to ask him about Cruel. Remember noticed how intently Deon stared at the portrait, then nodded after a short pause, saying he understood. Meanwhile, Duke Oster had already learned of Deon's return. With a cold sneer, he asked if the Emperor's dog had finally come back to his master. He turned to Cruel at his side and remarked that his little brother had returned. Cruel responded that he would contact the Assassin's Guild. The Duke questioned what would happen if they were caught. Cruel reminded him they still had another card to play. Turning to Cheyenne, the Duke asked if this was true. She clarified if he meant the Revolutionary Army, and he confirmed it. He explained that if the Revolutionary Army moved to kill the Emperor, it wouldn't matter even if they were discovered. Casting a sly glance at Cruel, he said he doubted Cruel would overlook something so obvious. Cruel averted his gaze and apologized, saying he would make contact with the Revolutionary Army. Oster smirked, wondering just how skilled the Emperor's so-called hero, Honorary Count Deon Hart, truly was. Back at Hart's estate, preparations for Deon's meeting with the Emperor were nearly complete. The maids admired him as they finished their tasks, saying that everything was ready. It suited him this way. They had changed him into clothes more fitting for his position, and were now wrapping bandages around his hands. He sighed wearily, thinking it was all complete chaos bathing, changing clothes, endless preparations. Finally, it came to an end. One of the maids remarked that his outfit looked amazing, but wouldn't he look even more striking in a military uniform? They continued presenting him with different outfits. Another maid disagreed, saying that strictness was in fashion now. Deon thought to himself, who said that? All of these outfits are just white. What are they even talking about? The maids began to argue until Rembrandt approached him. reminding him that the sun was still high, so he should wear a mask. Deon accepted the mask and thanked him, adding that although it was late, he was grateful for how Rembrandt had taken care of the estate during his absence. The butler wiped away tears with a handkerchief, saying that even if he died now, he would do so without regret. The young master has grown into such a wonderful count. It is an honor to receive your recognition. Deon adjusted the mask on his face and asked him not to speak that way, insisting that he was still in good health. But Rembrandt replied that it was not true at all. He ached in many places and had planned to discuss his resignation upon Deon's return. This shocked Deon. "What does this mean?" he exclaimed. He couldn't believe it. Rembrandt had been managing everything: personnel, property, finances, resources. Where could he possibly find another man of such talent? Deon stared at him in confusion, ready to say something, when the butler suddenly revealed he was joking. Deon froze in silence as Rembrandt laughed, saying his only joy was seeing the confusion on his master's face. He asked Deon not to be angry at an old man. Deon grew irritated, calling him an old fool in his thoughts, but Rembrandt pushed him toward the exit, reminding him that the carriage was ready. They left the estate and approached the carriage, where a group of knights had already gathered. Before climbing inside, Deon told them he did not need so much security, just a few attendants would be enough. A knight began to object, but Deon explained that few in the Empire knew about his return, and it wouldn't take long. The knight agreed and said that half of the troops would follow him, leaving the rest to conduct themselves according to rank. Settling into the carriage, Deon thought to himself that in the demon world, he had to flatter the Demon King, while here, he would have to flatter the Emperor. But the Emperor was just as fearless as the Demon King. The current ruler, Eduardo Desert, seized the throne by eliminating all competitors. He was the 9th prince, who killed all his brothers and sisters before crowning himself in clothes soaked with blood. Even 10 years later, the subject remained a heated debate. At the end of the coronation, which had begun with the slaughter of his relatives, the new king sat on the throne. His first words were that he had won his position by shedding blood, and thus he would abandon the kingdom's old name. From now on, under his rule, this country would be called an empire. With that decree, he declared himself emperor. Other nations could not ignore such an audacious act, and so the war began, an 8-year war that changed everything. Deon remembered those days. Closing his eyes, he thought of how it had been hell. Many of his memories were erased, buried under the sheer weight of horror. He had no desire to recall what he had forgotten. Perhaps that was why people said ignorance is bliss. But in the end, the empire swallowed a third of the continent and became a true empire, ruled by a true emperor. Thanks to his achievements in that war, Deon was granted the title of honorary count, though he could no longer remember the efforts that earned it. As soon as he stepped out, he saw they were under attack and demanded to know what was happening. On the attackers' clothes, he noticed blue armbands with a white bird, instantly realizing they belonged to the Revolutionary Army. How did they know about his return and arrive here so quickly? Things were turning bad. He needed to join the fight, but before he could, a revolutionary soldier appeared at his side. Without warning, the soldier grabbed him by the neck and shoved him roughly back into the carriage. Deon struggled to pry his fingers loose, coughing as he struggled to breathe. The man pressed down on him, pulling out an axe and demanding to know what this meant. Barely holding back the urge to kill him on the spot, the soldier smirked and said he had found the Empire's dog. The Revolutionary Army, formed during the deadly 8-year war started by the Emperor, had lost countless citizens and loved ones while fighting to reclaim their freedom. With nothing left to lose, they'd lost their sanity in their obsession with destroying both the Empire and the Emperor. Remembering this, Deon cursed the Emperor while gripping the man's hand. He blamed the Emperor for creating such reckless fools. Whatever they believed, he didn't care, he just refused to become their victim. The man sneered, saying he was disappointed. Rumors painted Deon as a hero, but to him, Deon looked like nothing more than a pathetic corpse. Breathing heavily, Deon forced out the words, "He was not the Emperor's dog." The soldier froze in confusion, then released his neck. Awkwardly scratching the back of his head, he asked Deon's name. When Deon gave it, the man immediately grabbed him by the clothes, lifted him up, and demanded if he was mocking him. He insisted Deon was the Emperor's dog, but Deon glared back and said his name was Deon Hart, not the Emperor's dog. The soldier studied him carefully. White hair, red eyes, a sharp tongue just like the rumors. But Deon wasn't listening anymore. His thoughts raced, "Where's my dagger? The moment he's distracted, I'll strike." In the next instant, he reached for his dagger and lunged. But his blade met the soldier's axe instead. Deon cursed he'd been blocked. The man shoved him to the ground again, snarling at him to stop fooling around. Deon's head slammed against the floor. Blood filled his mouth, his chest tightened, and it became hard to breathe. The soldier loomed over him, studying him. Is this man really a hero? Are the rumors true? Raising his axe, he called Deon a false hero and told him to curse the Emperor with his dying breath. The blade came down. But before it struck, a spear whistled through the air and slammed into the axe's handle, stopping it cold. The axe clattered loudly to the ground. Startled, the soldier clenched his trembling hand and turned. A knight stood there, smiling, boasting that his aim had hit dead center. Behind him, 2 more knights appeared, cloaks draped with the emblem of the Emperor. But the soldier's eyes widened when he noticed something. The emblems were torn. These weren't just knights, they were the murderous ghost knights, demons born from the 8-year war, led by none other than Deon Hart. Fear washed over him. How did they find us? Panicked, he shouted to his fellow soldiers of the Revolutionary Army, ordering them to stop the ghost knights at all costs. One of the knights casually pulled out a pouch, remarking that they couldn't possibly let them walk away alive. He popped a handful of pills into his mouth, and the soldiers' blood ran cold. The true terror of the ghost knights wasn't just their strength, it was their utter lack of reason. Once they took those pills, their eyes gleamed with madness, and twisted smiles froze on their lips. Their very presence turned monstrous. They charged together, one shouting for the others to kill them all. Watching them, the soldier realized the horrifying truth. These were nothing but pure brute force, just as insane as their commander. One of the knights slashed his sword across the back of a Revolutionary Army soldier, declaring there would be no easy death for them. Another knight laughed as he thrust his spear into his enemy, exclaiming, "Who cares? Let them enjoy it." Meanwhile, the knights accompanying Deon simply stood aside, watching the insane bloodshed. A Revolutionary Army soldier grew nervous, realizing that if they confronted the knights head-on, they would surely lose. He thought he needed to end it quickly and escape, but suddenly, pain shot through his face. Looking over, he saw Deon digging his nails into his own hand, scratching down to the flesh. Screaming, the soldier instinctively threw Deon aside, slamming him against the carriage wall. Breathing heavily, the man dropped his axe, raising his trembling hand to the wound as blood dripped down. In horror, he muttered that Deon was insane. Deon stood, smiling, and said he had wanted to rip it off completely, but was too weak. Grabbing the axe with both hands, he raised it high, declaring that if the soldier wasn't feeling well, he would give him a quick end. The man turned, trying to insult him one last time, but never got the chance. Deon's strike landed, killing him instantly. His body fell from the carriage. The revolutionary soldier who witnessed this wasn't afraid for long. Deon climbed out of the carriage, and a nearby knight cheerfully called him Captain. Deon silently discarded the axe, approached the corpse, and stared down at it. Though the man was already dead, Deon reached for a dagger, whispering that this wasn't enough. He needed to set an example so no one would ever dare attack him again. He straddled the corpse, plunging the dagger into its skull. Blood sprayed across the ground. He raised the dagger again, striking over and over with a wide smile, determined to make this scene unforgettable. Nearby, a ghostly knight pulled his sword from an enemy's body. remarking that Deon was ruthless enough to be their captain. His comrade, sitting on a pile of corpses, asked if it seemed like Deon didn't even need them. The knight glanced at Deon's escorts and scoffed that if it weren't for them, there would have been trouble. One of the escorts looked away in shame. When Deon finally rose from the corpse, he turned to the survivors with a mad gaze, ordering his men to kill the remaining enemies. The ghostly knights advanced. One revolutionary soldier collapsed to the ground in terror, while the other tried to keep his grip on a sword, but as the knights drew closer, he shook uncontrollably. By the time the sun set, Deon's carriage had arrived at the imperial palace. Guards noticed its filthy appearance, and one pointed out in shock that it wasn't dirt, it was blood. The carriage halted at the entrance, and Deon stepped out, approaching the doors. A guard blocked him, explaining that this was the imperial palace and entry required permission. Deon gave his name, insisting he must urgently see His Majesty. At the mention of his name, the guards gasped and immediately apologized. One recalled that His Majesty had granted Earl Deon Hart the right to visit at any time, but not in such a gruesome state. Deon asked where His Majesty was. The guard, flustered, replied that the Emperor was in the banquet hall. When Deon asked why, the guard explained that a celebration was underway for the debut of a new hero. Deon's wide smile stretched further as he asked, "A new hero? Then my brother must be here as well." Inside the banquet hall, Cruel knelt before the Emperor, who praised him for reclaiming land stolen by demons, calling it incredible. Cruel humbly replied that he had only done his duty. Rising, he accepted the Emperor's toast. Eduardo raised his glass high, declaring that today they were celebrating the birth of a new hero. Cruel Heart congratulated him on his debut and encouraged everyone to enjoy the festival. But suddenly, Deon interrupted the speech, throwing open the doors to the banquet hall. The ladies screamed in fear at his bloody appearance, one even crying out that he was covered in blood. Deon walked directly toward the Emperor. One of the nobles whispered that they didn't know who he was, only that he was incredibly rude. Another noted his red eyes and white hair. Members of the imperial family stared in shock, and the princess covered her mouth in disbelief. A noble finally asked, "Is this the honorary Count Deon Hart?" Leaving bloody footprints behind him, Deon reached the Emperor's side. He ignored his brother as he passed by, though Cruel glanced at him sideways without turning his head. Deon chuckled inwardly, realizing that his dear brother must have somehow obtained a hero fragment. Kneeling before the Emperor, Deon called him the Radiance of the Empire. He pulled back his hood, revealing his face, and respectfully greeted him. The nobles murmured among themselves, horrified by the blood. A lady covered her face with a fan and whispered that he must be a vampire. She wondered if the Hart family had truly adopted such a creature. The man beside her whispered that Deon had been bullied as a child, asking if perhaps his family had always feared him. Uster, standing among the nobles, smiled as he looked at Deon Hart, thinking to himself that Deon had survived an incredible show of perseverance. Meanwhile, Eduardo's expression hardened when his gaze fell upon the Duke. Returning his attention to Deon, Eduardo smiled coldly and remarked that it had been a long time. He noted that Deon could have come to him any time, yet instead chose to barge into the banquet covered in blood, interrupting everything. "What kind of disrespect is this?" he asked. Deon bowed his head and apologized, explaining that he had been ambushed on his way there. Eduardo repeated the word, ambush, demanding to know who would dare attack the Empire's hero. He thought it fortunate that he had sent knights to accompany him. Deon, however, remained silent. The Emperor set down his glass and suggested they move somewhere private to speak further. In a separate chamber, they sat down on sofas to continue. Eduardo asked again about the ambush, convinced by Deon's appearance that it had to be the work of the Revolutionary Army. Calling them sick fools, he asked if Deon needed a doctor. Deon dismissed the concern, saying he was fine. The Emperor reflected that everyone knew Deon as the Empire's great hero, yet so many looked at him with suspicion and contempt. But who else could compare to Deon, who had led the vanguard in the 8-year war and accomplished such monumental feats. He had even carried back the hero's corpse after the Demon King's defeat, something no one else had ever achieved. Normally, a fallen hero's body would be left for the demons to consume, but Deon had prevented such a disgrace. Still, the Emperor noted it came with a price. He asked if Deon had figured out how to break the curse. Deon realized he was speaking of the Demon King's seal. Smiling faintly, Deon touched the mark through his clothes and admitted he had not. To him, it wasn't a curse but a tracking spell. The Emperor, however, believed Deon had weakened because of it. Eduardo thought Deon was reckless with his own health. Taking a sip of tea, he said that in that case, Deon must return to the demon realm. Though he called it an unpleasant order, the implication was clear. Eduardo wanted to use Deon as a spy within the Demon King's castle, though he would never say it directly. Eduardo asked what was happening in the Demon King's castle these days. The reply was that nothing new had occurred, but after a brief silence, the Emperor pressed further. Deon admitted that he had met with an assassin who had been sent to the king's castle to kill him. Even though the assassin was just a pawn, he was still a candidate for the title of hero. Why had Eduardo sent him into the demon realm? Eduardo dismissed the idea, calling it nonsense that discredited the very title of hero. He explained that he had assumed the man would die before even reaching the demon realm. Yet, against all odds, he survived thanks to the hero fragment. That survival, however, had only elevated his position within the castle. He had even been named commander of the Zero Squad by the Demon King. Eduardo asked Deon if this was true. Hearing this, Deon grew nervous. He realized the Emperor already knew far too much. Rising from the sofa, he bowed deeply, begging forgiveness and explaining that he had not been in a position to refuse the assassin's application. The Emperor simply smiled, saying it was fine. He wasn't accusing Deon. The more widely the assassin was accepted, the easier it would be to gather information. And if he had even been acknowledged in the demon realm, then he truly was a remarkable talent. But before moving forward, the Emperor made it clear, if Deon had something to ask, this would be his last chance. Deon hesitated, then finally spoke his brother's name. With anger burning in his eyes, he demanded to know why his brother had been forced into the role of a hero. He already knew that the Emperor regretted not killing him back then. Deon thought bitterly that his brother had been the only other survivor of the Hart family, besides himself. Deon Hart. A memory surfaced. As a child, Deon stood on the second floor, as he often did, gazing up at the family portrait. Cruel approached him, calling out that their parents were already tired of waiting. Deon turned, calling to his brother as he hurried down the stairs, apologizing and asking if it was already lunchtime. Cruel reassured him and told him to hurry along. Deon, still anxious, grabbed his brother's hand, worried that he might be punished because of him. Cruel stopped, turned, and gently pulled his hand away, pressing it against his chest. He told Deon his hands were dirty. He had just returned from training. Deon gasped in surprise, then smiled awkwardly, apologizing and saying he didn't mind even if his brother's hands were dirty. Cruel continued walking down the corridor, and Deon ran after him, struggling to keep up. When Cruel suddenly stopped, Deon crashed into his back. Ignoring it, Cruel turned and asked if Deon really liked the family portrait, since he stared at it all the time. Delighted, Deon smiled and said that whenever he looked at it, he felt as though it told him they were truly a family. Cruel frowned, dismissing it as nothing more than a drawing. Deon looked away, scratching his head awkwardly, trying to say something else. But Cruel cut him off, telling him not to wander the house and to stay in his room instead. Deon clenched his fists. Inside, he admitted to himself that he always felt lonely. He remembered overhearing two maids talking about him. One asked if his red eyes frightened her. The other agreed, pointing out that his white hair also set him apart. She even questioned whether he really belonged to the Hart family at all. Hiding in the shadows, Deon kept listening, wounded by their words. But whenever he looked at the family portrait, he felt like he was truly part of them. He wished desperately that he had been born with green eyes and black hair like the others. Lost in these thoughts, Deon followed his older brother to the dining room. At the head of the table, their father sat waiting, his expression stern. He scolded them for being late, reminding them that he had told them to hurry. The imperial family's banquet awaited, and they were already behind schedule. His mother, with worry in her voice, called out to her youngest son, asking if he was unwell again. It would be bad if he got sick upon his return. Why shouldn't he just stay at home? Deon replied that he also wanted to go. His mother wanted to say more, but her husband asked her to calm down. Deon can't stay at home forever, she protested, asking how she could not worry. What if something happened to him when he was already so weak? Deon looked at her with dissatisfaction. Does that mean you want to lock me up forever? They had never shown his face to the emperor, and countless rumors had already begun to spread. This can't continue. He turned to his youngest son and asked if he understood. You must always be on guard when you leave home. No one should ever know about your shortcomings. The word shortcomings stuck with little Deon for a long time. He lowered his head sadly and promised he would keep it in mind. In his heart, he believed his parents were unhappy with him, his different appearance, his weak body. To such a famous family, these were unforgivable flaws. Suddenly, Cruel spoke up and asked his father if the rumors about hiring a new swordmaster were true. Deon looked at his brother, wondering if he was changing the subject for his sake, but no, his brother never cared about such things. His father smiled and confirmed it, explaining that as Cruel's skills improved, it was difficult to find a master worthy of him. His wife smiled too, teasing him that despite his words, he clearly enjoyed the search. Deon noticed how the atmosphere in the dining room shifted the moment his brother spoke. Cruel was amazing. But Deon, he was not the most outstanding child. Even when surrounded by family, he felt alone. And that loneliness, he convinced himself, was his fault. Lowering his gaze, he repeated in his mind, "It's fine. I'm still part of this family. If I try hard enough, I can be like my brother. Then they'll love me too." Soon after, the entire family attended a banquet at the imperial palace. While wandering the hall alone, Deon heard a child's voice calling out to him. Turning, he asked if they were speaking to him. 3 boys approached with sinister grins, asking if he was Deon Hart. Surprised, Deon's heart leapt someone his own age was talking to him for the first time. Smiling nervously, he greeted them, but fear crept in. What if I make a mistake? One boy asked why he was alone. Deon explained that his family had gone to see his brother's sword master. The boy sneered. Without you, don't you understand? Everyone already knows you're the black sheep of the Hart family. Isn't it true they locked you up? Flustered, Deon shook his head. Of course not. I was just sick. The boy leaned in close, grinning cruelly. You're lying. You're a dirty idiot. White hair, red eyes, your own family can't love you. They abandoned you. You're a monster. Deon clenched his teeth, trembling with anger, until finally he couldn't take it anymore. He struck the boy in the face, then, almost crying, shouted, "Stop! You don't know anything. My family loves me." Enraged, the boy hit him back. Deon fell to the ground. The boy crouched over him, grabbing his clothes, and began to pummel him while yelling, "Do you think you're a Hart just because of your last name? You're nothing but a monster, a mistake." Blood ran from Deon's mouth, his face bruised. In his mind, he screamed, "That's not true. I'm not a monster." Another child, seeing things spiral out of control, pulled his friend back. The beating stopped, but Deon's cheek was already swelling and blood stained his lips. As he lay there, thoughts of his family swirled painfully in his head. And then he heard his brother's voice calling his name from the side. He looked to the side and saw Cruel running toward him through the crowd of nobles, shouting in worry. "What the hell is going on?" he cried. He said something else, but Deon could no longer make out the words. Tears flowed from Deon's eyes before he lost consciousness. In his dream, he fell ill. A doctor entered his room to check his condition. Deon's parents anxiously asked how he was. The doctor explained that the second young master had a very weak body, extremely susceptible to stress and unable to endure the sun. He required constant special care. Though his liver was strong, everything else about his condition was fragile. Deon's mother covered her mouth in shock. "Is it really that bad?" she asked. His father buried his face in his palm, muttering that no such child had ever been born in their family. How could this happen? Deon opened his eyes in the dream and silently asked their forgiveness. He reached out a hand, thinking he would try harder just so they wouldn't hate him. But instead of his parents, his brother took his hand. Stroking it gently, his brother reassured him, "Everything will be fine." Deon smiled faintly, thinking that if his parents saw this, they would know he was loved. But suddenly, his brother added, "You don't need to do anything. No one expects anything from you anyway." Deon's smile faded. His heart sank as the words echoed in his head, "Monster." He jolted awake, gasping for breath, tears in his eyes. Sitting up in bed, he heard his mother's worried cries outside the door. His parents rushed into the room. His mother asked, "What happened? How could you get into a fight in the palace?" His father, displeased, reminded him, "I told you to be especially careful outside the house. And what did you do?" Even though their son had just fallen ill, the first thing they did was scold him. Deon trembled with fear and apologized, insisting, "They started it first." He remembered the cruel words of that boy and wanted to explain, but he covered his mouth, stopping himself. "Dad wouldn't believe me anyway. What if he thinks the same as those kids?" He stayed silent. His mother began to cry. His father hugged her and said it was too soon for Deon to go out into the world. He would remain inside the walls of the house for now. With a stern look, his father ordered him to stay in his room and reflect on his actions. After they left, Deon sank into dark thoughts. He didn't want to be abandoned. He wanted to be loved. But he was certain they were disappointed in him. He couldn't afford any more mistakes. He needed to try harder to overcome his weaknesses. He had to become someone who would not tarnish the Hart family name.